you can't take anybody out for a walk anymore. I mean, it's astonishing what these two managed to extract from next to nothing, or something that seemed very slight and part of the great sort of cycle of activity that goes on. And I was astonished to see the spacecraft hovering over Watling Street and remembering. The thing with Andrew, as you've seen, is that everything is live, everything is performance. He says, I'm always waiting for him. That's true, because he always says, I'm arriving at 6:32, which means he's arriving at 6:52. He gets off the train in Canterbury, and standing quite near the station, as in Dover, and standing by the station in Dover, as in Canterbury, were these very neat Mormons. And I think, oh no, he's not going to, oh God, he does, he's straight over. So he's into the banter with the Mormons. And this is all, very funny, we've heard it a million times. But the thing is that it made me see something about Mormons that I'd never realised, which is the reason they do this pitch beside the station is because the faith is based around the idea that there's a train with reservations for the honoured members who are part of the faith. The train, and so they've got kind of half an eye on the station in case this celestial train is about to arrive. And you don't get those things without being with Andrew. And we hadn't gone very far when we began to see signs that said Canterbury 4 miles. And every 5 miles we walked, it was actually getting further. So something very bizarre was happening in that landscape of the oilseed rape. And then arriving in Canterbury again, he goes into the full shtick of performance art with glasses and everything in a Premier Inn. And so while he's doing this, the thing is clicking away and all the last rooms are going. As he says, the only one room left was the sort of disabled toilet. And I said, you're having it. And you have to have sleep in there. And then you're hallucinating by the time you get finally allowed something to eat. And it's this restaurant called Byron, and it's Korean, serving a Kim burger. I mean, can you kind of imagine? It was all too much to be true, but it strangely was all true. And that's the process. And John, again, was I guess, a similar process, and inspired, as he said in the beginning, by seeing Andrew's film Gallagher. But also, it's kind of rigorous because you're doing these things every single week. And how you manage to shape something out of such disparate material. And underlying theme of sort of honouring the process that Alan Moore did when he was writing Unearthing, I guess.
Yeah, it's. I mean, one of the things I loved about Gallagher, which actually is at odds with what we do here in a way, is one of the most romantic scenes. The things that made me go and get a camera was the bit where you're posting all those envelopes of Super 8 films somewhere in Scotland, and there's a line where you turn to the camera and say, "I don't even know if we're ever going to see this again." And obviously, you're watching it in the cinema, so you know that they did. But you also the jeopardy of that, which also brings with it an incredible romance with it as well. It's the romance of the journey. I mean, for me, I was in the middle of, actually towards the end of a kind of 3-year bout of travelling, and was going to go through India on the way, and Italy, so I bought the camera to do that with. But there's the romance of travelling, which is brilliantly captured in both of your works. But then also, that creative process and the element of jeopardy of the act of creation and the documentation and the recording of the process of the journey that then intersects with it. I mean, digitalisation, I suppose, removes that in some respects, but then by imposing a discipline on yourself that you're going to, when you go out for a walk, I mean, you might think something that Nick Dimitri does. My old mate who I've made films with, made a film with Nick called The London Prangler, and in the end Nick got tired of every footstep being recorded and refuses cameras and dictaphones and all sorts now. But then that reimposes that kind of jeopardy into the process, that there's going to have to be a product.
The thing I'd ask Andrew, taking on from that, is that when did you discover to work with this form that was better than truth? I mean, you decided from the start. I completely kind of got on board with Gallivant. I remember seeing it because I was lucky enough to have the chance to review it. And I was so carried away by the presences in the film that I literally believed, in the sense that Eden and Gladys were travelling with you as part of it all the way. But of course, the logistics were that wasn't it. But it doesn't matter. None of it matters. I mean, the only truth is what you finally decide on what you've got. And I think your process of doing that is very rigorous, and you're always going to subvert, always going to bring in these other things. How did you come on that form?
I think in many ways it's not dissimilar to your practice, which is whereby you just make things up as you go along. But I think maybe when I made Gallivant, which is 22 years ago now, since we in fact we started off just down at some of you might not have seen the film, but it was also shot on celluloid, mainly Super 8 and 16mm, but we started down at the Dollar Pavilion and we travelled in a clockwise direction. We circumnavigated the whole of the UK. We were on the road for almost 3.5 months. Gladys and Eden, my daughter, they kind of join us. But you can still hear me even though this has gone down. I think we've lost it, it doesn't matter. There's something about the not knowing that has always been very exciting. And I think you can over-intellectualise or become too academic about your process and maybe too articulate in your head before you even start doing it. You become too knowing, too clever, too organised. And it's only maybe been in the last 10 years that I have any idea about what I'm doing. And it's, I remember Stuart Lee, I think when we made Swandown, I kept it in. I was chatting to Stuart and interviewed him just after he'd done one of his gigs in London. He said the thing about you, Kotting, is that you go out there and you do stuff. You have no idea why you're doing it, but you reverse engineer meaning and structure into it afterwards. So, and it's very easy, I think, now that things have become more digital. If you want them to be digital, I'm still very keen to work with analog. Is that you can kind of bring things together in an edit suite, and you can introduce other elements, and maybe in the same way at tangents with the way that Iain works when he's writing. Things that have occurred to you, things that you somehow stored away either literally in your memory banks, or you have old records or old sounds or conversations that begin to collage together and make sense, and they take you in that process into different directions. A bit like maybe when you're free-forming or automatic writing, and then you're trying to corral a sense of order to it afterwards. And it's an easier process. It's an easier way of working than having a script and having a shot list and having a whole crew of people around you that you have to. That's when you direct, but it's not. It's more about making films.
Well, I mean, the world of film had become, as the world of art, really the art is getting the commission. So there's this form of endless meetings. Every project comes with all that, and both of you have found ways of guerrilla filmmaking that completely bypass that. If we decide we're going to do something tomorrow, build a raft and go out to the Royal Sovereign, you just do it. If you can do it, you do it. And if not, no. But you just don't do that thing, because otherwise the whole world is that. Which leads me into the question I'd like to ask. Is while we were doing both the Swan project and the walk, the Brexit walk, you were accusing me, jokingly all the time, of being a Marxist, because I was moaning about the Olympic site development and various other things. And there's a underlying theme in what I've been doing, I guess, since the time of Downriver, of trying to subvert or counter a lot of the energies I found in the city politically. And John has been very active, in representing all kinds of other countercultural activities and housing issues and so on. So John is clearly involved on that level, as well as doing these strange walks. And Andrew, your kind of work is its own energy, and it's very much, or I would say, on the level of the human and the humorous and the kind of absurdity of things. And you kind of avoided those other issues, although they're there. And I've just wondered, in terms of the idea of the city I have, is the idea of a city that combines the kind of mythical roots with the kind of political realities of the moment, which have to be dealt with in other ways, including art and film. So maybe I'll ask John first, because I asked you that when we were walking, doing an overground walk with John Rogers early on. You know, I said, you've seen everything. What is positive? What is the positive energy in all this? I'm going on and on about these things that I can see and describe as being wrong around us. What have you discovered? And you just didn't answer. We're very candid. But later you did, and I'm kind of again. I'm just throwing those other sides of things to you, because I know kind of how you both work, and I respect it very, very much. But I kind of wonder about that other side.
Well, I suppose there's two answers. I mean, in a way, it ties it together. It's that thing about just going out there with your camera that we were talking about, and that's one of the things that's led me into working with.
Back to the early Russian, the idea of witness, just the Vertov and the train. You know, the idea of going back, since we're in a kind of Russian cinema, is this idea of, in some senses, what you have to just simply do is recover it, record it, tell the story, and then let people make their own minds up from that. But it is important to be out there, taking the story and recovering it.
I think there's lots of things. So on a basic level, where the two parts of my work sort of cross over is that making a record, and if there's no record, then they can change the narrative. If you make a record, there's something to counter the official. And that's one of the things that goes along with large-scale developments is the rewriting of the record. And they re-narrativize the area to fit their commercial ends. And I did a walk around the Olympic site actually with somebody who used to live in Clays Lane Housing Co-op, and he lived there for 12 years. He was one of the kind of block coordinators. That was Europe's largest tenant-run housing co-op. It's now the velodrome. And when Iain contested that transfer of use, he was threatened with violence, I think. So it shows you what you're up against. But so if there's a record, and Chris actually couldn't remember, so I was asking where various things were, it erased his memory. So in a way that confirms that the importance of making a record. But then, you know, through doing that, if you go, well, that's what I can contribute, I don't have any other skills, I can just be there with a camera and bear witness. But then, like, actually something I filmed yesterday, so people go, oh, you've got a camera and you're prepared to turn up at these things and shoot something. I was in a room yesterday at the Welsh Centre on Gray's Inn Road, funnily enough, with a bunch of housing, not activists at all, so people that work with tenant-run organisations, community-led organisations, all talking about ways they're buying land and building 100% owned, council-owned or community-owned, socially rented properties in London. One of them is in Kensington, you know. So, in terms of, you know, what do I see happening, you know, is the response to it is fantastic. But also a lot of people are under the radar. So if you're doing interesting stuff in London, actually it's quite good to stay under the radar. And that's where you find the artists, and you find creative people. A lot of them are old anarchists, old punks, or people probably that washed up in Hastings at one point as well, before it got too expensive. But, you know, that's that spirit, really, of just going out with a camera to see what's there and making a record and sharing it, and then continuously responding and reacting and being very responsive to your environment and being in your environment as well.
Andrew, can I also say something, because we went back recently and looked at Pepys Estate, which you lived in, and I've been thinking about it because there's a film from John Betjeman who shot in a helicopter. He flies over this estate and he's extremely scathing about what it's like to live in these sort of estates, and yet everything I'd read of Andrew's time there was filled with kind of energy and joy and delight in all the smells and stinks and difficulties and the banter and stuff that was going on. So in a sense, you've got a wonderful, walking around it with you and Eden, there's a terrific kind of emotion as to engagement of place in what was supposed to be somewhere that was really bad to live.
I think maybe just to rewind a little bit, and I was mindful of kind of the first question, and then there was another one, and then there were some other things. So now I'm completely lost. How many hands have I got? I should be fine. I think in many ways, and perhaps in this sense I'm closer to the way in which Iain works, is that I really enjoy and love taking from the real and using the real in a collagic way that's kind of vaguely apolitical. I think it's more interested in the notions of spookiness and notions, it's a very kind of buzzword now, hauntology. And I think hauntology kind of fits what I do quite perfectly. And it's an attempt to, an alchemical attempt, to put bits together in a sometimes irreverent way, sometimes a piss-taking way, sometimes in a political way, to try and create something else. And it's the other. It goes back to using place, to using the specifics that we're very familiar with. It's very ubiquitous, whether, you know, in terms of certainly the bombardment that you get from radio, whether it be political kind of issues, you know, in terms of Brexit, but to drink from that trough, to pull from that trough. And like Iain, I have to feel the ground beneath my feet. I kind of feel that I have to be worthy of any kind of critique or any kind of alchemical collagic process through having been out there and done it. And then when I get back, then it becomes a lot more kind of hermetically sealed. And I really enjoy, and I think maybe that's why I'm always inspired by writers. Literature has always been the biggest influence on my work, is that you become sealed up in that place, you know, that kind of inscape, that headspace, that Ballardian bit that we all live with. And then just through trial and error, something begins to happen. And it involves stamina, but most importantly, it involves having been to that place. And Alan talks about place, we all talk about place. And now that I am here in St. Leonards-on-Sea, almost 15 years, you know, 22 years after we made Gallivant, it just feels completely pertinent and right and rich and potent and powerful and magical. And you know, Iain again talks about the angels of happenstance. Happenstance or serendipity has always informed, you know, what I do, and occasionally, but you have to be out there making it happen. You know, I don't think as an academic or as an intellectual, you can't really. I mean, Peter Ackroyd might be somebody that, you know, can sit indoors, and he will employ researchers to kind of glean the information, to get those facts together that he then begins to work with quite brilliantly. But Iain would never trust the facts of anybody else. He has to actually experience that firsthand. And I think in many ways that's what I'm doing. And I think John, to a certain extent, is doing exactly the same, but there's an immediacy. And certainly go to John's blog. It's called, what is it?
The Lost Byway. The
Lost Byway. It's really very much of the moment. It's happening now. And it's that kind of urgency and immediacy and the way in which John works that is antithetical to the way I work. You know, I need to kind of burrow into it, dig into the material like an archaeologist. And yet the gathering, the hunting and gathering, the gleaning, the accruing of stuff is what we all do.
I mean, it's something I don't know if either of you would, you know, respond. I mean, I think something I've observed possibly in both of you, Iain latterly with Black Apples of Gout, and Andrew, I think it's in your work throughout, is when I'm often asked this question of what brings it together and what connects things and why you do what you do. I mean, for me, a key quote came from one of the biggest inspirations for me when I was in my early 20s, you know, late teens, early 20s, was Dario Fo. And there's a quote, Fo wrote a sort of theoretical text with his wife and partner, Franco Rama. And it opens with a quote, "Everything has its origins in the place we are born." And he worked a lot early on with the kind of dialects of where he grew up, where he lived, which no one really speaks anymore. And I wonder if that's something that you felt resonating or informing your work.
Yeah, I was talking the other night when down in the Electric Palace about something interesting. One interesting aspect of getting really old is that the borders, and Andrew probably got there from brain damage playing rugby years ago, is that the borders between self and world begin to dissolve and wear away, especially with walking and travel. There's a passage between you, the you-ness that you're holding on to, and the you-ness that's out there, which I was talking about in terms of Steve Moore, who at the end of Alan Moore's piece is where this character Steve Moore literally becomes, in a sense, this walk around Shooter's Hill that he does nearly every day. And the extraordinary thing is that Steve Moore kept a very intricate dream journal, quite like William Burroughs in his latter years. And Steve had written this description in his dream journal on Thursday, I think, of a dream about a ladder coming up to the room in which he was sleeping, and a face kind of appearing at the window and trying to break into the house. The following day, I think, he died in this room, and in fact nobody really noticed that he wasn't around for a few days. And someone came, and a ladder was put up to the window, and someone climbed in and found him dead. And then the really weird thing was that over that weekend, this was on a Friday, I think on the Saturday and Sunday of that weekend, he was seen moving around the same part of the walk in a blue shirt that everybody described that he was actually wearing when he was found dead, as if somehow his imprint and the exchange of molecules with that part had become absolute. And I think that is what happens with plays. The sheer fact of tramping around London pavements for 40, 50 years, in a sense, you in the end, you're just a medium. You don't really have to do anything. Well, now I've got two people who just sort of make the dream for you. Go out for some walk, and there's a piece of work. Fantastic. And that's exactly what happens. And I think this happens with time. And I think Rudolf Steiner said about people who are trying to recover lost memories, that the only way to do it was to go back down memory sticks. You put sticks into the topography of places that you remember and work your way back down. And what I did with that is to go back to Gower in South Wales, which I was asked to do a book for Little Toller, who are really good topographical publishers. And they said, will you pick one of your favourite spots in London and write a book about it? And I thought, no, I can't. I mean, the place I need to go back to are these savage carboniferous cliffs in Gower, and walks I've done at various stages of my life, particularly in childhood, trying to get into this cave, the Paviland Cave, which had the oldest ritual burial in the British Isles. And although I'd done this walk numerous times, I'd never actually got into the cave. It was hard to find and hard to get in. So I went back and made another account of it and wrote the book. And the thing that happened in that book was, I realised the opposite of what happens in London. In London, every time I go out, I'm confirming a kind of identity, because it's a somewhat performed identity, like Andrew's. It's the performance of being a writer and somebody who's interested in the city. So I see the same people, I see the same landmarks, and it works like radar beams. So every time at the end of a walk, I'm more fixed in being myself and in the job than ever. When I was in this Welsh landscape, you realise that you as an individual had no significance whatsoever. The thing was so ancient, and that walking over it was a disappearance, back into the memories of childhood. And once that had all been worked out, I said at the end, I'd done the book, but I hadn't got into the cave, and I realised, in the way that Andrew is describing, that making the work of art gives its own shape, and it tells you what to do in your life. I had to go back down there, got straight in the car, went back down there with Anna, and went to the spot where you get access to the cave. And that day, there's only very few days in the year, the tide was right out, you could actually get access. But I couldn't figure out how to get down the cliff drop at the bottom. It seemed to be impossible. And then crawling along a cliff face to see if I could crawl around the corner, suddenly I see a woman appear out of nowhere who's standing talking to Anne. And she's saying, oh, do you want to see the way to the cave? I'll show you. And there's a little kind of chasm down to the side. You slide across and then climb up the rocks on the other side and into the cave. And there it is. And this was an astonishing moment. It was like going back to find one of the things that was much deeper than my childhood. It was a sense of the human entities that had been there thousands of years ago, when there was no Severn. We were coming across a hot plain, and you could see this mound, a golden cap, covered with golden lichen, with a cave in, and the red ochre on the ritual burial of this person. And then discovering that the bones I thought were this, that I'd seen in Swansea Museum and gone to see for many years, were fakes. And the real ones were in Oxford, in the Pitt River. So I go down, so it's an endless story. But anyway, that is how it works. And it works that you travel into the past when the moment is right. And you're led into it by a piece of work that you do, which you don't know is going to end in that way. And the little coda to this was that Andrew was persuaded to come back with me, and and we weave it with the story of the horse's head. There's a myth called the Mari Lloyd, which is a white horse's head dug up on New Year's Eve. It's a poem by Vernon Watkins, and the dead are supposedly returning to try and get into the houses of the living, and they're led by this white horse's head, and they would sing poems outside the house about the people inside the house, satirical ones in Welsh, and the people inside had to respond, and when they couldn't anymore, they had to let them in and give them drink and cakes. So Andrew decides he's going to get a white horse's head, a rubber horse's head, and he's going to go across into this cave. Of course, when we get there, nature resists. The waves were pounding in, it was impossible. We couldn't get down to the beach or any of that. And at the end of the day, we go back again at what's supposedly low tide. It's again impossible. He throws himself in with a GoPro camera on his head and the rubber horse's head, and he swims across and he clambers up and he gets into the cave. Of course, it makes a kind of astonishing piece of film. But that strange piece of work emerges from something that was long drawn out and took a lifetime to get to. And yet, you know, here it is. This instant response makes a piece of work. And I think probably that's the way it goes for all of us. So that's maybe it.
Yeah, unless if there's any questions, I mean, anybody would like to ask any questions to Iain, then he normally has some really good answers, but my answers are facetious and John's normally very political, so you're going to have to... facetious as well. And facetious as well. But it's quite hard to see, but are there any questions that anybody would like to ask? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about The Last London for Iain. You wrote Dining on Stones about a journey from Hackney to St. Leonards-on-Sea in 2005. To what extent is The Last London an echo of that book, or do you not feel that they are directly related?
I've got to go all the way over there now.
You do?
They're very definitely related in the sense that they're part of a sequence, and they're related in other ways too, but essentially there's no direct connection other than the idea at the end of Last London of a return to the coast and Hastings, thanks to this walk that 5 of us did from Waltham Abbey, which brought us really together as a group with Andrew, Claudia, David, who was drumming all the way, and Jem Finer, who was recording sound with a strange device that he'd made, and Anonymous Bosch, who was hovering around taking pinhole photographs. As if we were kind of, it's almost like a science fiction story, as if we were survivors from some sort of Holocaust that was walking across a last landscape. And in that sense, the Dining on Stones was an anticipation of that, in that it took this book, the building rather, Marine Court, as a kind of ship of fools, an enormous, grandiose project, which was rather wonderful and also doomed to fail, in the sense that what it set out to be in the first place, and yet it's in a magic place. And this building generates a narrative about the A13, an earlier attempt to escape from London or go down the Thames estuary. But more interesting to me now, it also had a secondary element in it, drawing on Joseph Conrad and on my own great-grandfather's book that he wrote about an expedition in Peru, whereby he was sent by the Peruvian Corporation of London to see if you could grow coffee in an incredibly remote and difficult place to reach. And his style of writing was so like mine, I just felt I was never doing anything more than repeating his tropes of his own life. And the great thing that's emerged from that now in subsequent research that my daughter's done with these indigenous people is that they had an extraordinary sense of time, whereby up to the point of these 3 Scotsmen arriving out of nowhere, their sense of time was plural, and it was topographic, in that there was no past, present, future. If you wanted to make contact with ancestors and ancestor time, you just walked to a particular place, you knew where to go.